It's Levi Brackman here with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to continue talking about postmodernism. Before I jump in, please, if you like this podcast, if you like the episode, please like it, leave a review wherever you listen to the podcast, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, whether it's on Spotify. Leave a review, like it, so that other people can also find it. Thank you so much. Now let's get on with the episode. Although in the last episode, I mentioned that I was going to delve into an alternative to postmodernism, I've decided that it's important to continue one more episode to talk about some of the impacts of postmodernism on our culture today, and specifically how it has impacted Judaism, numerous elements of Judaism, not just liberal Judaism, but all other kinds of elements of Judaism. My view here is that postmodernism is the zeitgeist. It is the spirit of the time, and it has such a strong influence that a lot of people have a postmodern view of things without even realizing where these ideas come from. And therefore, I wanted to point out some ideas and some practices that have made their way into Jewish practice on the liberal side, but also on some other more conservative or more orthodox sides of the equation, and to show how postmodernism really has impacted almost every single aspect. And if we know and are able to tease apart what are the areas and aspects which are influenced by postmodernism, we can then arm ourselves with that knowledge and then make a decision. Do we want to go along with this or not? But at least when we know where it comes from, we then have the ability to make a decision. Often what I find is that people don't understand the influences on their thinking and the postmodern origin of the ideas and the practices that they are implementing in their lives and in their communities. So I hope that this episode is helpful in that regard. Now, I know that this episode is also going to be relatively controversial because I'm going to touch on some hot button issues. I don't mean to offend anyone. I just mean to bring attention to this and to the origins of these ideas, and also perhaps why I disagree with them. I think reasonable minds can disagree without being disagreeable, but I do know that the nature of the people who I'm disagreeing with, they might end up being disagreeable, be that as it may. Now, I know some people might think that this really sounds like a conspiracy theory, that there's this massive postmodern ideology which is looking to infiltrate every aspect of our culture. But that's actually not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there's a zeitgeist. There is somehow this ideology which started off with philosophers in France like Foucault and Derrida, and they've had an outsized influence on academia, but also these ideas have infiltrated and filtered down into the average person, how they think about things. Some ideas end up being viral and they end up catching fire. And the postmodern ideas really have caught fire in a big way, and they've made their way into almost all aspects of society. And people just think in a postmodern way today, and that has an influence. But people don't necessarily know and understand where their way of thinking comes from. They don't necessarily understand the history of ideas, which I've explained in previous episodes, and they also don't know that some of the ways in which they live their lives are uniquely postmodern. So to spread the curtains, so to speak, and look out the window and see in the clear sun of day where the ideas that people think, and therefore
what actually is driving a lot of these decisions and a lot of these trends, you see postmodernism under the covers lurking there. So I want to give a number of examples and try for you, my audience, to connect all these dots. So last week we spoke about polyamory. Today I want to talk about the genderism that is going on, with this transgender, gender fluidity, etc. Because that is really a very postmodern thing, not transgenderism itself. There have always been people who have had gender fluidity. There have always been people who have been born with undetermined gender. So that's always been there. Actually, the Talmud talks about an androgynous, which are people who it's not clear whether they're male or female. So this is something that has always existed amongst humans. So this idea of there being some designations between male and female is nothing new, and one ought to have a lot of compassion for people who find themselves in that gray area. And so nothing that I'm about to say is to say that we shouldn't have a huge amount of compassion and understanding and patience and love for all these people. That being said, the idea that there is no such thing as a gender and that anyone can decide whatever gender they want to be, and the whole idea of gender is fluid, that is a uniquely postmodern idea. Now, my son was invited by his school to go to another school in order to be able to recruit for his school. So my son is a senior in a high school, a modern Orthodox high school here in Connecticut, and they recruit from various different schools. And one of the schools that they recruit from is a non-denominational Jewish school. By all accounts, he did a great job in talking to the students, and he even played a little bit of basketball with them. And we're very proud of what he was able to do there in recruiting and talking up the school that he goes to. And we're very, very happy with the school that he goes to. So I'll give it a shout out. It's called New England Jewish Academy. The staff there are fantastic. The students are fantastic. And it's just a great school. And he sent me a picture as he was going around this other non-denominational school of a bathroom in the school. And on the door it said gender-neutral bathroom. You might say, what's wrong with having a gender-neutral bathroom in the school? And in and of itself, there is nothing wrong with it. Why not? Both men, boys and girls can go to it. It doesn't have to be just a boys' bathroom and a girls' bathroom. Anyway, it's just one stall, and it has a door, and it seems like it locks from the inside of that door, so you're not going to walk in on somebody who's a person of the other gender, and therefore it's a gender-neutral bathroom. What's wrong with that? So, truly, in and of itself, there is nothing wrong with it. But underlying having a gender-neutral bathroom in the school is because it is catering for students, and this is, by the way, K through 8th grade. So this isn't like high school or beyond. This is K through 8th grade. It is catering for kids who are confused about their gender and not sure whether they're male and they're not sure whether they're female. And it's catering for those kind of students. Now, being an androgynous is rare. I remember when I was a kid, there was a kid in the school who was very, very disabled. Unfortunately, he passed away since then, but he was very, very disabled. And they actually built a special bathroom for this kid in the school, because he was always in a wheelchair and there was no way he could be using everyone else's bathroom. So he had this special bathroom, and everyone knew this was the bathroom for this kid. And when he went in there, he went in with his carer, etc. So it is very nice for a school to be able to offer this type of service for kids who need it. Now, if that's really what was going on here and why this school had a gender-neutral bathroom, I would have absolutely no issue with it whatsoever. The school has an ethos about being very sensitive to and allowing this transgenderism to be something which is in the open, and that the students should be educated about it and should know about it and should know that it's an option to be transgender if they want to, and their teachers are allowed to be very open about it, and they have therefore a gender-neutral bathroom. Now, what's the issue with this, one might ask? Well, the issue, again, in and of itself is, one might say, is fine, although I wouldn't want to send my child to a school where they might be actively being confused about their gender. That's not something I would do. If people want to do that, that's fine. There is a lot of confusion which goes on anyway as children, and they need to be encouraged to get out of that confusion. And there's definitely confusion about identity in all kinds of ways. And instead of being encouraged to continue with that confusion, they should be encouraged to figure out what they truly are with regards to their biological way they were born. So that's just my opinion, the way I look at it. But underlying all of this is this postmodern idea, which says that how are we to know and judge what is the reality here or what is not the reality here? Because the reality that we have according to postmodernism is only my subjective experience of reality. And I can't experience reality outside of myself. So every time I talk about reality, I'm bringing my own bias to that reality. And therefore, reality can never be any kind of objective. It always has to be subjective. And therefore, who am I to say that this person's male or female? The person may be born biologically male, but they're not male. They're actually female. And the reason why, just because they were born biologically male, I'm calling them male is because of my bias. But really, they're not male. They're female. And the second I question that, as we've discussed, that's because I'm being biased, I'm being oppressive, and I'm being prejudiced towards this person who's actually female because they feel that they're female, even though they may have been born a biological male. From my perspective, I'm more of an empiricist. I'm certainly someone who believes in and accepts the premises of the Enlightenment. You might consider me a logical positivist, where I believe that there is a way in which one can actually find and identify empirically what is more real. There is some kind of empirical evidence when someone is born a biological male, that they're male, and that's what it means. I had a conversation with somebody who worked for the UN in the area of sexual health, and he tried to explain to me that a woman is whatever the person feels is a woman. And if the person feels that they're a woman, then they're a woman. And I said to them the following. Imagine I had a child who felt they were a monkey. What should I do? Is the child a monkey or is they not a monkey? The guy laughed at me. He said, of course they're not a monkey. They're human. So just because they feel like they're a monkey doesn't mean that they should be considered a monkey. And I said, but why not? The child actually feels they're a monkey. So shouldn't they then perhaps be a monkey? But, biologically, and if you check their DNA, they have human DNA, not monkey DNA, and therefore they're not monkeys, they're humans. And I said, well, shouldn't we see gender in the same way? He goes, oh, no, gender is different. I'm like, but please explain to me why gender is different. And he couldn't explain that to me. And the point is, there are some people who would say, no, if your child feels they're a monkey, then perhaps they're a monkey. There are people who will say that because those people want to be consistent all the way through. The point I'm making here is that this argument, which says that who am I to say the person is not a female just because they were born as a biological male? Perhaps they are a female, and because I think that they may be male, that's because I'm bringing my prejudice, and I can't possibly be objective, and I have to respect where they come from. That is a postmodern idea, as we've explained. That idea comes from postmodernism. On to the next thing, which is in synagogue, they have a cantor, or the person who leads a service, who is transgender. The person used to be a male and has undergone some kind of transition, presents themselves now as a female and leads the service. You might ask, what's wrong with that? That's fine. Well, they don't discriminate. So why can't you have a transgender person lead the service as well? I'm not saying you can't. You can if you want to. But there is something in the Torah, in the Bible, which says that a man should not masquerade as a woman. Now, one might argue, yes, there are those who say that that has specific limitations to it, that means they shouldn't masquerade as a woman in order to be promiscuous. Yes, I know, I'm aware, I've studied that. There are commentators who say that the limitations of a man not wearing women's clothes is only if they're doing it to be promiscuous, but if it's kind of part of the clothing, that's fine. However, there's also the spirit of Judaism, which says that men should not dress up as women. You've got women and you've got men. These are two genders. Yes, there is an androgynous, and there are certain halachical Jewish law parameters which are associated with an androgynous. However, the spirit of the law is a man should not masquerade as a woman. When you go to a synagogue, you want to do Judaism. If I go to a kosher restaurant and they're serving pork on the menu, I'm going to be offended. This is a kosher restaurant. Why are you serving non-kosher food? That doesn't mean that people shouldn't be allowed to eat non-kosher food. I will fight for any Jew's right to eat non-kosher food if they want to. There shouldn't be anyone forcing a Jew only to eat kosher food. But if you go to a kosher restaurant, you expect there to be kosher food there, not pork, which isn't kosher. When you go to a synagogue, you expect the spirit of Judaism. The question is not who deserves to lead the service, but who should qualify to lead the service. And this is a really important distinction because merit is something we really believe in. People qualify for certain things and can be disqualified for certain things as well. Now, when we talk about leading the service, who should qualify for leading the service in the synagogue? And the answer really is quite clear. It's someone who exemplifies the values of Judaism. As a matter of fact, there is a cherem, that means there's a certain type of excommunication which exists for people who behave in certain ways, and one of the parts of that excommunication is they're not allowed to lead the service. So, for example, if someone beats somebody else up in the community, there is a cherem, there is a excommunication that takes place, and they're not allowed to lead the service. Now, that isn't always implemented, etc., but that is part of the values, that if you behave that way, you can't lead the service. If you are a minor, you don't qualify to lead the services. A woman, according to some opinions, is not qualified to lead the service because it says that it's not honorable, it's not covered for the woman to lead the services. Now, some people argue, no, today women can lead the services because it says in Shulchan Aruch, for example, Tov Ayin Beis, it says that Kol Nashim Shalom Nikros, all women today are considered to be important, and therefore it is honorable for them to lead the service. So there's a good conversation which can go on about that as well. But there is this concept of qualification to lead the service. Even in liberal Judaism, they would say there are certain people who cannot lead the service. For example, if you are a known fraudster, someone who is a pedophile. Now, I know that this can be very offensive and will be very offensive to transgender people, because how dare I equate a transgender person with a pedophile? And the answer is, I'm not equating it on the level the way today's society sees it. I'm equating on the level of the way Judaism would see it. Judaism would see them both as being something which it says in the Bible one should not do. There's a law which talks about that the law of the land is the law, and you have to follow that law of the land. And the law of the land says that you're not allowed to do that. It's illegal. It would be totally wrong to do it, morally and ethically wrong. So no one should make the argument that I'm trying to say that that's okay. So again, when you come to a synagogue, when I come to a synagogue at least, I would like that synagogue to practice Judaism, not to practice postmodernism. But I'm saying on the level of Judaism, which is when you go to the synagogue, you go to do Judaism, you expect Judaism to be happening in the synagogue, and you don't expect something else which isn't Judaism. But what has seeped into Judaism is postmodernism. And postmodernism, everything's relative. Now, I know that plenty of people are going to try and cancel me for this. But the nice thing about where I am today is that I'm not affiliated to any organization. I used to be once upon a time, but I am no longer affiliated to any organization. I don't have an employer, and I don't have anyone who can truly cancel me. So I can talk my mind here and be very clear about what I'm saying. And that is that postmodernism has seeped into Judaism. I'll give you another example of this, which seems to me to be very clear. So there is a certain rabbi who was fired from his job because he opposed someone senior on the board who was making inappropriate comments to other women in the synagogue. And he wanted that person fired, or that person at least not to have any leadership position in the synagogue. Why? Because in today's environment of Me Too, we can't have someone who leads a synagogue who is making inappropriate comments to women. And I think that's a fine position to take. He's right. You can't have someone in leadership of the synagogue who is making inappropriate comments to women and making them feel uncomfortable. But then why would that same rabbi be quite happy to have a transgender person take a leadership position in the synagogue? If Judaism is your benchmark, then that inconsistency does not make sense. But if postmodern ideology is your benchmark, then it makes perfect sense. Because that man is the oppressor. And we can't allow an oppressor to have a leadership position. We can only allow people who understand their oppressive nature and are able to hide it and live with that humility and not allow that oppression to take place. And especially if it's oppression over people who are oppressed. And women are the oppressed class. And men are the oppressor. And when a man dares to act as the oppressor, we need to take him down a peg. But what we should do instead is we should take the oppressed class, which is a transgender, and we should push them forward into leadership, because it's good to have those which were once oppressed now into leadership. It is uniquely a postmodern ideology.
I would like to present another example of this, which is found maybe more in traditional Judaism or even Orthodox circles. And that is the questioning of reality itself, which I have noticed. And without getting into details, if you look into the Talmud, you find a lot of medical discussions, you find conversations about the science of the time, and there's a acceptance from the Talmudic scholars, from the Tanaim and the Maroim, very clearly about that what the science has presented to them, that is taken as that is the way it is. So there's medical remedies presented, there's ideas with how, for example, if you look in the laws of kashrus, you find, well, how do I kosher a plate? And these are all based on things which they've observed, and there wasn't a questioning of the things they observed. What they observed, they accepted as fact. This is the way it is. Perhaps they got the science wrong, but the reality is, in those times, they accepted based on what the contemporary scientific understanding was. That's what they accepted. Now, sometimes there was a debate between what they called the scientists of the world, the Chachmei Umas Olam, the wise people of the world, and the Chachamim, and about certain things. There was a discussion and a debate about it, but there was definitely a nod and an acknowledgement of the fact that there is some type of science of the time which told us how the world works, and we accept that. And even the mystics accepted that the world existed, and they said, well, even though, from mystical meditation, it feels that maybe that everything's God and the world doesn't exist, but the fact is that the world was created, and therefore there is a world, and there was an acceptance of the reality around us. What we're finding today is that people are questioning that reality of the world and saying that actually no, science is wrong. And what we see in the book is right, but what scientific evidence exists, that is wrong, and we can discount science entirely. And I would argue that that's a uniquely postmodern position to take. And the only way that that really flies today is because of postmodernism. In other words, because our minds have been conditioned by a postmodern ideology, which is so pervasive around us, we can look and say, yeah, you know what, maybe science is wrong, and I don't have to accept science at all, and I don't have to accept reality as it's presented. This type of knowledge gathering of science is something I can ignore because I have another knowledge gathering that, and although that my evidence shows me one way, I can ignore that entirely because I have another source of knowledge, which is intuitive knowledge, which is just as good. I remember many years ago, I had a teacher, and his name was Rabbi Yoel Kahn, very famous, well-known teacher in the Chabad movement. He was somebody who would listen to and then repeat and memorize the talks of his teacher, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe. And I remember him explaining to us that when you have incontrovertible reality of the world in front of us, and you have what the Torah says, and they seem to totally contradict each other, you don't reinterpret the world and the reality, you reinterpret the Torah. Because, he said, the Torah and religion is never going to tell you something which opposes reality and facts as we have it in the world. That was his view. And one of the examples he gave was that he said that when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, there was a section of Orthodox Judaism which said that couldn't have happened because it says in the Psalms, Hashemayim, Shemayim Lashem, V'aretz Nasan B'nei Adam, that the heavens are the heavens to the Lord, and the earth he gave to people, and therefore people can't go to the heavens, and therefore that couldn't have happened. And he said that when you see reality that it actually happened, you have to say, I misunderstood that verse. That verse can't mean that. And that was the way of thinking about things throughout Judaism. But today, you have a lot of people who are willing to say, no, actually science is wrong, and we can ignore science, and we can ignore facts, and we can see the world the way we want to see it based on whatever our intuition tells us, and science be damned. Now, moving on to why all of this is so pernicious and why we have to be so careful about and understanding postmodern ideology, because when it comes down to the micro, it's not that important. It's how people behave. Maybe not that important. But then when you look at it globally, it becomes very, very important. So, for example, this type of ideology which sees the oppressor and the oppressed as not just equal, but somehow the oppressed has this kind of added value and is more important. You end up with this situation where just because someone is not privileged, therefore somehow they are better, and that ends up allowing for all kinds of really bad behavior. It leads to the moral equivalency between someone who's defending themselves and someone who is hurting other people. And it's worth reminding ourselves the core of where this comes from. Again, as long as you don't see anything as being objective, it all comes from your subjective experience, then everyone can feel whatever they want and say, this is a good source of knowledge. And then when you compound that with the idea that you have the oppressed and the people who oppress them, and then anyone can actually come along and say, I'm of the oppressed class because I feel that I am of the oppressed class. And therefore, now they can basically claim some kind of moral high ground. Although the truth is, it seems like postmodernism doesn't have any kind of moral high ground, except being of the oppressed class rather than the oppressor class. So if you are, in their view, quintessentially of the oppressed class, then you now go and they have the deconstruction, and now you go from the periphery to the center. You're the most important. So as long as you're in the oppressed class, you can jump in and say, I can do whatever I want. So that is how you end up with this moral equivalency, that you end up where the transgender person ends up leading the service, and where you have the person who's been accused of talking inappropriately to women ends up being thrown out. It ends up in the same situation where you can have ideas which are totally off the wall and are totally contravening any type of reality. They're accepted by whole communities. Whereas someone who brings up and says, well, there are facts here and there's science, etc., those people are to be thrown out and are cancelled and are ignored entirely. It is that same pernicious postmodern ideology which ends up saying that Hamas are the heroes. They're the freedom fighters, and it's the Israeli army and the Israelis who have had thousands of rockets indiscriminately thrown upon them and have been oppressed, and Jews have been oppressed for years. They end up being the oppressor, because as soon as you grab that oppressed status, you now are in some way in the center and everyone else is in the periphery. It is a morally blind ideology. It is blind to facts. It's blind to reality. It's blind to science. It is pernicious and it needs to be opposed. And I feel that I need to oppose it wherever it rears its head. And that's why I've spent this time talking in this podcast, trying to explain it in its great details. And in this episode, I'm trying to explain how this postmodern ideology doesn't just exist on the left. It has made its way throughout, through liberal Judaism, through modern Orthodox Judaism, to right-wing Orthodox Judaism. This pernicious and pervasive ideology has made its way everywhere. And therefore, it's really important for us to be aware of it, what it is, what its fundamental roots are, what it posits, and then know, is what I'm talking about here influenced by postmodernism? And if it is, I would argue one should be very, very careful and be judicious in what one's opinions are and what one's practices are based on that ideology. Now, I just want to say one more thing here, which is really important, because there's a massive caveat, and that is the whole oppressor and oppressed dichotomy. It's really important that we're clear that Judaism has a very important value about taking care of the oppressed. If you look at Isaiah, for example, where he's criticizing all the kings of Israel, one of the main criticisms is not related necessarily to the idol worship, but it's related to how they treated the people who were oppressed, how they treated the orphan and the widow and the stranger, the immigrant. The idea of having compassion for and treating the oppressed properly is incredibly important. That is a value, a fundamental value of Judaism. Where postmodernism gets it wrong is that it takes to the degree that you have to have people fall into one of two categories. Either they're the oppressor or they are the oppressed. Judaism doesn't see it that way. You can at once be not oppressed and not be an oppressor. Whereas postmodernism says if you're not being oppressed, then you are an oppressor. So that is, and Judaism doesn't see it that way. Judaism says if you see someone who's oppressed, you need to have compassion on them and help them, and do whatever you can to take away their oppression. But then, when they're not oppressed, doesn't mean they become an oppressor. In other words, you can be a good person who's privileged and have your heart in the right place and help people who are oppressed. That's the value which you find in Judaism. That's what you should be. And you should look out to make sure that when you have privilege, you still take other people who are oppressed into consideration and help them out. That's a fundamental value of Judaism. Not to fall into the trap of saying, well, since postmodernism is wrong, therefore we shouldn't care about the oppressed. No, not at all. We just have to think about it the right way. So I think I've covered how pernicious and how pervasive postmodern ideology really is and how it really has filtered down into everything. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about an alternative to postmodernism and a uniquely Jewish perspective on all of this. I've hinted to it in multiple ways in this episode, but next episode, I'm going to give a full treatment of it. And then in the following episodes, I'm going to have some guests on who are going to talk about postmodernism and Judaism. I'm sure some of them are going to bring a slightly different perspective to it, which I'm looking forward to. I'm always looking to learn. I'm always looking to learn how it was wrong. Please, if you're out there, if you would like to give me your perspective on it, please let me know as well. Leave a comment. Again, I don't mean any of this to be controversial, but I do think this is something important that we should talk about and be aware of. And therefore, I'm talking about it in a clear-cut way and being very forthright about the way I see it. So again, thank you so much for joining. This has been Levi Brackman with Truth's Jewish Wisdom for Today. And until next time.